Hi everybody, I'm Katie Birtwell from the Walpole Historical Commission. I'm sure it's true in every city and town in America that some old buildings remain for years and others are now only memories or remembered in dusty photographs. Many of our oldest buildings in Walpole have been torn down, fallen down, or lost to fire and flood. We used to have a match factory in Walpole. We had a coffee factory. We had a mattress factory, which used to be the hoop skirt factory. We had a rag recycling business. We had Fales Ironworks. We had the Bird Companies. We had Kendall. We had Walpole Woodworkers, now gone, replaced by residential and office condos. The Walpole Tavern greeted hundreds of visitors in South Walpole during the stagecoach days, only to fall when the church next door needed an education wing and a parking lot. Excellent use was made of the old Multibestos site on South Street after it was declared a Superfund site and cleaned up by the EPA. The renovated land became the new home of our police station and the senior center. Such is the way of the world. Some folks think that if a building is old, it's no good and it needs to give way to modern structures. Other folks think that the old-timers are worth saving. This episode of Stories of Historic Walpole is in two parts, and this is the first. So let's look back and see our town as it used to be. Many buildings have been built and have fallen in our town. There aren't records for a lot of them because for a long time, if you wanted to tear down a building on your property, you just did it. Some buildings were demolished because they were structurally unsound. Sometimes powder post beetles decimated the oldest homes. During the Great Depression, few had the money to save the old houses. Often, old buildings had been rehabbed so many times that little of the historic features even remained. And once in a while, a colossal weather event like the hurricane of 1938 knocked the old buildings flat, not only in Walpole, but all across New York and New England. A change occurred here and across the Commonwealth in the early 70s, when each town set up its own historical commission. Our demolition delay bylaw was enacted in Walpole in 1973 and was updated in 2018. According to the town website, the Historical Commission reviews any demolition application for structures either more than 100 years old or on the National or State Register of Historic Places. If the structure is historically or architecturally significant, the Commission may delay the demolition for up to 12 months. There is a set procedure, including public hearings, to ensure due process. And the purpose of a demolition delay is to try to convince the owner to rehabilitate it or to sell the structure as a historic building. However, the law favors the right of landowners within the law to do as they like with their own property. That means that after the delay has expired, the demolition can, and often does, take place. So, thousands of buildings in Walpole have come and gone over the last 300 years. So let's take a look at some of the most memorable structures no longer standing in Lost Walpole, Part 1. the Bradford Lewis Community Center. At the corner of Main and East Streets, where Conrad's now stands, once stood a large building and several outbuildings owned by the Lewis family. As you know, the Lewises built and operated many mills, both downtown and where Plimpton Street crosses the Neponset River. One of these gentlemen was Bradford Lewis. Of course, George Ransom is the expert who can tell you all about him. In fact, George lives in Bradford Lewis's first house. But Mr. Lewis is relevant here because his second house once stood where the Main Street Shopping Center is now. He lived there because his cotton waste, or shoddy mill, was on the other side of the railroad tracks near where Gilmore stands today. Some years after his death, his son donated the front house to the nearby Orthodox Congregational Church for a community center. It was a handsome structure that was used by townspeople and church members for weddings. It even had a gymnasium. But it only lasted for, well, less than 20 years. 1938 was not a good year for Walpole, or anywhere else for that matter. The Depression dragged on. The possibility of war in Europe troubled everyone. On September 21st, the most powerful hurricane to hit New England since 1815 brought destruction to our town with little warning. The Orthodox Congregational Church on East Street lost its steeple and was irreparably damaged. The parishioners needed a new church and fast. They did own an old Unitarian church on Common Street, but that one needed repairs and had been closed for the last 10 years. Faced with this crisis, the parishioners made some hard decisions. They resolved to sell the lot on East Street, where the damaged church stood, to Joseph and Perina Gallo. They also wanted to sell the land on Main and East Streets, including the Bradford Lewis Community Center. Well, the church lot brought $3,500 and the Lewis lot brought $12,000, a good amount for those hard times. With a vigorous fundraising effort, the parishioners raised sufficient additional funds to rehabilitate the old Unitarian church on Common Street and reopen it in 1940 as the United Church. So, what happened to the Bradford Lewis Center? The property was sold, buildings and all, to a guy named Louis Bomar, who planned to build a Gulf gas station in its place. He demolished it, but in keeping with those Depression times, he was careful to remove and probably reuse the windows. By 1940, 2 years after the hurricane and for many years thereafter, a new gas station and an A&P market stood at the Main and East Street corner. So from that time on, you could get a fill-up and do your week's worth of grocery shopping all at the same time. So it was farewell forever to the Bradford Lewis Community Center. The Reynolds Hartson House. If you lived here prior to 1973, I'm sure you remember the big white house that stood at the corner of West and Elm Streets, right where that four-way stop is. This spot was once the site of Walpole's first schoolhouse. In the 19th century, Dr. Andrew Reynolds built his one-story house and medical office there. And when his daughter Susie married C. Fred Hartson, he added a second floor for the newlyweds, and it became known as the Reynolds Hartson House. Now, this house stood off the town common for many years, at least until nearby Kendall Mills wanted to change the traffic flow in its parking lot. The Walpole Times made this conflict front page news in 1973. Kendall, which owned both the Deacon Willard Lewis house and the Reynolds Hartson house next door to it, wanted to donate the Lewis house to the town in exchange for the closure of Station Street, which crossed its parking lot. Kendall officials argued that having Station Street cross the parking lot endangered the very lives of their workers, and they wanted it gone. Kendall had little to say about the Reynolds Hartson house, except that if it were demolished, they would donate enough land so that Elm Street could be widened into a two-way street. Much dealing was done behind the scenes, but when all was said and done, Kendall announced in the Walpole Times that they had decided to donate the Deacon Willard Lewis house to the town. The town, in turn, could then lease it to the Historical Society, which it did. Of course, Kendall had already gone ahead and demolished that lovely big white house on the corner. And so that's how and why the Reynolds Hartson home disappeared in December of 1973. Elm Street was widened, and that portion became a two-way street to match the rest of Elm Street. But Kendall was unsuccessful in convincing the town to close Station Street, which still runs through the former Kendall parking lot. Now, to the best of my knowledge, no one was ever run down. And in the ultimate irony, Station Street is still there and Kendall is not. The Old Stone School. Some of you went to grade school at the Old Stone School, a large and imposing presence that stood at the corner of School and Stone Streets. The new Walpole Public Library stands there today. The Old Stone School stood directly behind the old town hall and opened its doors in 1886. During the next 95 years, it housed many grades as the number of students rose or fell. For instance, the old school was closed when the new stone school, now the town hall, was built in 1950, only to be reopened in 1954 to accommodate all those boomers. So the old school had certainly earned its place in Walpole's history, but its end came on October 23, 1981, after it was deemed too unsafe and too expensive to renovate. By then, the student population had diminished. Even the Boyden School in South Walpole was closed. The baby boomers were well into adulthood when the Old Stone School came down. And it's no surprise that many of them miss this reminder of their time as a Walpole kid. But let's leave the story of this vanished school on a humorous note. Just as folks reused parts of old structures in years past, part of the school lives on. One enterprising Walpole citizen built himself a nice garage from the remains of the boys' restroom. The Walpole Tavern. Beginning in 1806, Walpole was the midpoint on the Norfolk-Bristol stagecoach line. 30 to 40 stagecoaches came through Walpole each day. They ran from Boston to Providence. Once you got to Providence, you could take the steamship to New York City if you were so inclined. Now, coming from Boston, you could grab a meal at the Fuller Tavern in South Walpole, built in 1807 and standing together as a private home. Going back to Boston, you could eat at the Walpole Tavern on the other side of Washington Street from the Fuller Tavern. And yes, the business owners agreed to share the business in this way. Why? Because there were a lot of people coming through. But that was not to last. The railroads came to Walpole and outcompeted the stagecoaches. In 1846, the South Walpole Methodist Church was built next door. In future years, next to the Walpole Tavern stood Billings Hall, used by the church, and the Hamilton's store, where they sold just about anything that folks in South Walpole might want. The Walpole Tavern eventually became an apartment house and the home of Carrie Hamilton. Long after she had gone, the end came for the Walpole Tavern. The South Walpole Methodist Church wanted to build an educational wing and a parking lot. Unfortunately for the venerable old building, it was in the way. The Walpole Tavern and the buildings next to it were razed on August 14, 1963. Now, if you take your child or grandchild to the South Walpole Community Preschool, the driveway entrance is where the Walpole Tavern once stood. So remember the old place and try to picture stagecoaches racing up Washington Street instead of cars. Everything changes with time. We've journeyed all over Walpole today, and I hope that you join me for part 2 of Lost Walpole. This is Katie Birtwell from the Walpole Historical Commission, and I thank you for watching.